Hello, my friends. This is the Mystery Preacher again. In our last messages, we talked about a post-resurrection life for Christian believers. Let's look at that subject a little further. Let's take another look at our key verses. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16, in the New King James Version, reads, "Therefore, from now on, we regard no one according to the flesh," that is, our rational, sense-based understanding. "Even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him thus no longer." And Paul's heart's desire in both Philippians 3, chapter 10, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death, and his verse that I base my messages around, in Ephesians 3, chapter 9, and to make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery. There's something much more than the usual exercise of Christian faith that is possible. Much, much more. Paul calls this mystery a fellowship that seems to have only come close to being experienced by a few noted in the Bible. What do we look for? Or who do we look at as an example? Certainly we could look at when creation started in the garden. I carry a mental picture of the Lord coming to walk and talk with Adam in the evenings. Think of that experience. What kind of small talk did they have together? A daily moment to stop and smell the roses with the Lord? Perhaps show off the latest additions to a flock. Point out some freshly hatched birds in a nest. Maybe note something that needed to be trimmed. Can you picture a God who would be personally interested in those kinds of small things? Perhaps we need to expand our view of the resurrection life in smaller as well as bigger ways. Abraham had a pretty special relationship with the Lord. Not many people are openly called a friend of God in the Scriptures. When judgment and destruction were about to fall on Sodom and Gomorrah, 3 persons visited Abraham. We find out one was the Lord, one is called an angel, the other is not specified. Perhaps the full Godhead. In Genesis 18, verse 17 through 19, "And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him." And in later verses, we see Abraham bargaining with the Lord, making the case for mercy if he could find 50 righteous men in the cities. That requires a degree of boldness, but boldness not based on self-promotion, but as the last 2 verses show, the confidence of a covenant that recognizes each has a knowledge of the other. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Abraham admonishes the Lord in verse 25. As the figures turned to leave toward the cities, Abraham continued to stand in the Lord's way and argue down to 5 righteous persons to save the cities. Moses is another with a close relationship. In one place, God boasts of him as the meekest man on the earth. With the boldness that made him stand up to the king of a world power, lead thousands of people out of slavery there, part the waters of the Red Sea. Perhaps meekness isn't the negative characteristic of weakness the world often portrays it to be. In Psalms 103, verse 7, tells us that Moses had a mind shared with the Lord. Verse 7, "He made known his ways unto Moses, his acts unto the children of Israel." Just seeing the impressive acts of God didn't give them the relationship or the confidence. The parted Red Sea, manna falling from the sky, birds flying through the camp for food, millions of gallons of water from a rock in the middle of the desert, the top of Mount Sinai shaking and on fire when the Lord came down on it, a huge pillar of cloud by day and fire by night as their constant protection and guide. All of those things didn't keep them from turning back to worshiping the demonic gods of Egypt. Since one of our theme verses has Paul desiring to know the fellowship of Christ's sufferings, Job might even be a person to learn from. He's described in the first verse as perfect and upright, and one that feared or respected God and eschewed or rejected evil. In fact, when Satan hatched his plot against Job and came before God with the other angels, the Lord boasted of him to Satan. In Job verse 8. And the Lord said unto Satan, Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that fears God and eschews evil? Well, aside from the temporary effects of attacks from Satan, having God personally say, There's no better person on earth than you, is a pretty good testimony. And he came through everything Satan threw at him and recovered all with God's stamp of approval. Job chapter 2, verse 10. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. We could see Job as God's prized student, with allowed circumstances for the purpose of teaching a rebellious angel something about the goodness of God. Recall what Paul said was one reason we should know and preach the mystery gospel. In Ephesians 3, verse 10, to the intent that now to the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be known by or through the church the manifold wisdom of God. Even though Hebrews chapter 11 is filled with the heroes of faith, for a short, accurate summary of that fellowship of the mystery, I think of the angel's greeting to Daniel in Daniel 10, verses 11 and 19. Verse 11, And he said unto me, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved. In verse 19, and said, O man greatly beloved, fear not, peace be unto thee. Be strong, be strong. We will talk more about the intimate realities of the mystery that is so much more than we see without revelation from the Lord opening our eyes. But the central reality will likely escape us without the awareness of God's predisposition toward us, shown by that affectionate description of Daniel, a man greatly beloved. Do you feel that you are excluded? Hear Jesus' prayer to Father as he approached Calvary, John chapter 17, verses 22 and 23. And the glory which you gave me, I have given them, that they may be one, even as we are one. I in them, and you in me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that you have sent me, and have loved them as you have loved me. Have loved them as you have loved me. When you were still in the loins of Adam, God, by his Spirit, looked through 6,000 years of covenant blood and knew you would be here. We'll talk more about the details and the still under-exercised power that God wants you to be operating in. But here, know the motivation of 6,000 years of God's purpose directed towards you. A while ago, I saw a video recording of a young lady's baptism. She had a degenerative disease that had paralyzed and stiffened her legs and arms, severely limited her ability to even swallow, and had confined her to bed for several months. They had to carry her into the church, into the baptism pool, to place her in it. Can you imagine the sense of helplessness? Paralyzed, and someone about to submerge you in water. When she came up on her own feet, hands in the air, and stepped out under her own control, fully healed, and at first surprised and wondering what had happened. Realizing Jesus had totally healed her, not because of great faith, but because of great love that passes understanding. She lay prostrate on the floor, worshiping and repeating with tears and joy and wonderment, "You do love me, Lord. You aren't mad at me." He loves you no less, and such love exists to be experienced. My friends, the religious limitations of old and blurred understandings of Calvary have left many with the same flawed idea that God's primary objective is punishment. But stay tuned, because the mystery of God is that this same love, which took action in the garden, not only did something at Calvary that raised Jesus from the dead, and no other religion on earth can make that claim, but also put believers on the cross with him, in the grave with him, raised with him, and seated with him in heaven. But you have to recognize it and receive it to experience it. By revelation, Paul asserted it. But now is the time before Jesus' return to show you the details of your supernatural conception that makes you capable of far more than you've ever dreamed. This is the Mystery Preacher telling you to tune in again, God willing, when you'll find out why Paul said it takes a supernatural mind to take it all in. And of course, you have a supernatural mind. You're listening to the Supernatural Mystery Gospel. From the Mystery Preacher, have a supernatural day. Say yes to Jesus.